Welcome to the Sci-Fi Evolution channel. Zorian Valloris had 3 goals when he enrolled in the Interstellar University of Advanced Knowledge Exchange program. To avoid failure, to find a decent cup of heavenly nectar somewhere in this corner of the universe, and to understand why his supervisor had such a strange smile when she approved his application. After 2 turns of his stay at the most prestigious academic institution in the known cosmos, he had not achieved any of these goals and was beginning to suspect that his supervisor had set him up for a grandiose failure. The Interstellar University spanned 17 dimensions and had a student body that included the galaxy's most brilliant minds, or so they claimed. Zorian began to doubt this after witnessing his classmate in theoretical physics spend 6 cycles calculating the ideal angle to hold his writing instrument. "Today we're going to try the impossible," Professor Quillmore announced, his rainbow feathers shining with undisguised pride. The scientist towered over us, reaching 9 feet in height, when he was completely bloated, as he is now, after he had brought himself into a state of intellectual excitement. The unsolvable challenge theorem has puzzled our greatest minds for over 12,000 cycles. Zorian looked around the exam hall, noting the presence of his classmates. To his left sat Ftar, a crystalline being from Zephyria Prime, whose species was known for its computational abilities. Ftar meditated for the last cycle, his crystalline matrix buzzing with barely contained intellectual energy. To his right, Brain Hive 7 occupied 3 chairs, being a collective intelligence that required multiple physical forms to accommodate their enormous cognitive capacity. "The theorem," Professor Quillmore continued, "exists at the intersection of 17 different mathematical disciplines, includes the principles of quantum uncertainty, and requires an understanding of dimensional theory, which most species completely lack. It is, by definition, unsolvable." "Then why are we trying to solve it?" Zorian asked, genuinely curious. There was silence in the room, and Professor Quillmore ruffled his feathers with what Zorian understood to be the equivalent of a condescending chuckle. "Oh yes, our human exchange student, Mr. Valloris. This is not a problem that can be solved. It's a test of intellectual humility, a reminder that some challenges exceed individual abilities." "Is that so?" asked Zorian, pulling out a mechanical pencil from his pocket. "So this is something like one of those philosophical things where the path is more important than the destination. Although I didn't expect such insight from a species that has only recently mastered the manipulation of fire." Zorian decided not to mention that humans have been using fire for about 200,000 years. Correcting Professor Quillmore's casual xenophobia seemed like a waste of energy, and besides, he was eager to see this seemingly impossible theorem. Other students were busy setting up their complex devices. Ftar activated a crystal array that projected intricate geometric patterns into the air. Brain Hive 7 immersed its 3 bodies in a processing configuration that was buzzing with computing power. The Etherin student behind Zorian began a ritual chant that was said to be necessary to access higher mathematical concepts. Zorian unscrewed the cap from his pencil and waited. Professor Quillmore walked to the center of the exam room, his claws clicking on the polished floor with theatrical precision. The room itself was a marvel of alien engineering. The walls were lined with quantum inhibitors to prevent students from accessing external computing resources, but there were also anchors of reality to maintain stable mathematical constants and what the brochure described as lucidity enhancers, which Zorian was sure was actually expensive mood lighting. Quillmore dramatically spread his wings and proclaimed the infinite recursive impossibility theorem. The air above him shimmered, and symbols began to appear in the holographic image. Mathematical equations of dozens of kinds flashed by, seemingly twisting through the dimensions. Zorian struggled to understand what was going on, with at least 17 different types of calculus competing for a place. Zorian squinted at the display. It looked like someone had taken a math textbook, put it through a blender, and then tried to assemble it during an earthquake. This theorem, Professor Quillmore continued, clearly delighted, has been thoroughly studied by the most brilliant mathematical minds in the galaxy. The cognoid collective spent 800 cycles on it before declaring it to be transcendent. The crystal masters of Zephyria built an entire computer the size of the moon just to comprehend her initial statement. Vtar's crystal matrix pulsed with energy. "The vibrations of my homeworld still echo from our efforts," he stated, his voice producing harmonic frequencies that made Zorian's teeth ache. "We reached an understanding level of only 0.003% before realizing its sublime impossibility." Brain Hive 7 agreed in eerie unison, their three heads nodding in perfect synchronicity. "We have devoted 12.7% of our collective computing power for 6 centuries, but the theorem surpasses the limits of the solution space." Professor Quillmore expressed his displeasure even more forcefully. "Indeed, the theorem includes paradoxical infinities, requires simultaneous calculation of several probability timelines, and involves at least 4 mathematical operations that technically do not exist." Zorian raised his hand and asked if he could get a physical copy of the proof instead of a visual display. The professor's demeanor changed slightly with annoyance, but he gestured, and the printed version materialized on Zorian's desk. Zorian took it, scanned it quickly, and immediately understood why everyone thought it was unreachable. It wasn't. It was just extremely intricate. The theorem was hidden under layers of complex mathematical notation, dimensional frameworks, and what appeared to be numerous false trails designed to lead mathematicians into theoretical dead ends. However, under the complicated presentation, Zorian could discern the real problem. It was a difficult task, but not an unsolvable one. Zorian was reminded of those text tasks from his school days, starting with a train leaving Quellis in 3 turns, traveling at 60 galactic miles per hour. He spent several paragraphs describing the weather, the conductor's breakfast, and the historical significance of the railroad before moving on to the actual question. While his classmates began their complex problem-solving processes, Zorian grabbed a napkin from his lunch bag and began sketching. Vtar activated something resembling a crystal Christmas tree, experiencing a spasm. Each facet of his array calculated a different aspect of the theorem, projecting the results in light patterns that were supposed to represent mathematical concepts too intricate for direct understanding by biological minds. Brain Hive 7 entered what they called deep computing mode, their 3 bodies forming a triangle, their arms intertwined, their eyes rolling back, emitting a hum reminiscent of a server farm experiencing an existential crisis. The student, Vispamala, performed what appeared to be an interpretive dance. Each movement seemed to correspond to different mathematical relations in the theorem. Zorian looked around the room, looked at his napkin, and began to write. After 20 minutes of the exam period, the room was filled with the sounds of intense intellectual activity. The Vtar crystal array emitted harmonic frequencies that made the walls vibrate. The hum of Brain Hive 7 reached such a height that it indicated that they were processing terabytes of theoretical mathematics per second. Vispa's interpretive dance turned into something resembling a cramp performed by someone who really understood geometry. Zorian was scribbling on his napkin, glancing at the printout of the theorem from time to time. "Is it difficult for you to get started, Mr. Valloris?" asked Professor Quillmore, clearly pleased with the opportunity to observe human cognitive limitations in real time. "You might prefer a simpler task. We have several basic addition tasks from the first-year curriculum." "No, I'm fine," Zorian replied, wiping something on his napkin. "I'm just trying to figure out why you made it so difficult." The crystal formation of Vtar pulsed with what Zorian recognized as the Zahirian equivalent of laughter. "Complicated? The theorem exists in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Our minds can barely comprehend its fundamental structure, let alone the method of solving it," Zorian said, still drawing. You're working in 17 dimensions when the actual math only requires 3 or 4, maybe. There was silence in the room, except for the buzzing and crystalline vibrations. Impossible, declared Brain Hive 7, without interrupting his computational trance. It's a concept, he added. It's like when your navigator says that he's recalculating the route because he can't figure out where you're going. The theorem tells you to ignore this part and move on to the actual math. The theorem is like a placeholder, just as your navigator says that he is recalculating the route because he cannot figure out where you are going. The theorem tells you to ignore this part and focus on the actual math. Zorian replied, "The same approach. Start with the obvious before disassembling the engine." He returned to his napkin, ignoring the growing annoyance of his classmates, who were struggling to comprehend the idea that they might be overcomplicating the situation. The fourth period, chaos, lasted for 7 cycles. At the 6th cycle mark, Zorian put down his pen and stretched. The napkin in front of him contained what appeared to be a relatively simple set of calculations, some basic algebra, and a small diagram that looked like it belonged in a high school geometry textbook. "I'm done," he announced. The room exploded into chaos. The FTAR crystal array immediately began flashing, indicating what Zorian recognized as the Zahirian equivalent of a system malfunction. Sparks flew from several crystal nodes as they tried to process the impossibility of someone completing an unsolvable theorem in just 6 cycles. The hum of Brain Hive 7 changed pitch. Suddenly, the frequency increased to such an extent that the quantum inhibitors began to emit a warning signal. The synchronized meditation of the 3 individuals was disrupted as 2 of them began to argue with the third about whether they had interpreted the exam criteria correctly. Vila, the dancer, stopped in her movements, which were obviously quite dangerous in the context of advanced mathematical interpretive dance. She immediately began to flicker between dimensions in such a way that Zorian felt slightly unwell. "Impossible," said Professor Quillmore, his voice rising to such a pitch that it suggested that his species had evolved from something similar to air raid sirens. "The theorem cannot be solved. It's mathematically impossible by definition." "Well, about that," Zorian said, picking up his napkin. "It turns out it's not impossible. It's just poorly organized." He stepped forward, ignoring the stares of the other students, who stared at him as if he had just claimed to have invented gravity. Professor Quillmore made a sound that could have been hyperventilation if birds could hyperventilate. The trick was to realize that most of the theorem is just a fancy way to wrap up a simple problem. Zorian began, pointing to his napkin. "You have a standard polynomial equation here, decorated with some dimensional nonsense that does not affect mathematics. Then you have 3 separate infinite series that seem complicated until you realize that they all describe the same curve from different perspectives." He pointed to his diagram, saying, "The impossible part comes from these paradoxical loops, but they're just the mathematical equivalent of asking what happens when an irresistible force collides with an immovable object. The answer is to rethink the question," he continued, "because you're asking the wrong question." Professor Quillmore sounded like a teapot going through a crisis of existence. "Show me your work," he demanded. Zorian shrugged, starting to write on the blackboard, translating his notes from a napkin into a more formal format. It took him about 2 cycles and involved a step-by-step process that anyone could understand. Who studied calculus and wasn't intimidated by complex notation? The FTAR crystal array finally rebooted and immediately began checking the solution. The results were accurate, eerily accurate, flawlessly accurate. "This can't be right," Brain Hive 7 insisted. However, their 3 bodies were already independently performing calculations, and all 3 had come to the same conclusion. "Oh, that's right," said Zorian, putting the cap on the pen. "Besides, I have about 53 cycles of exam time left, so if anyone has any other impossible theorems, I'll be happy to take a look." It was exciting. Professor Quillmore made a sound that could only be described as the mathematical equivalent of a scream. By the time the exam officially ended, half of the mathematics department had gathered in the room, as well as representatives from at least 6 different academic institutions, 2 news crews, and more. It seemed that the janitor, caught in the crowd, was quite puzzled. Zorian was sitting in a corner doing a crossword puzzle from an ancient Earth newspaper. Meanwhile, the most brilliant minds in the space were debating whether his decision was legitimate, brilliant, or evidence of fraud. The mathematical test was conducted by Dean Splinter, a jelly-like creature known for his analytical abilities. She was currently purple in hue, which, as Zorian learned, meant deep philosophical stress. Dean Cohesion stated, "Every step is logical, the proof is impeccable, and the solution is verifiable. But that's impossible." Professor Quillmore insisted for the 15th time, losing at least 3 pounds of feathers and showing no signs of slowing down. He stated, "The theorem remained unsolved for 12 millennia, and civilizations perished in their attempts to solve its mysteries. Perhaps these civilizations should choose to use pen and paper instead of building computers the size of the moon," Zorian suggested, his eyes glued to the crossword puzzle. 7 horizontally, unnecessarily intricate. 9 letters, any ideas? Dr. Tentacles, a philosophy professor, seemed to be going through a mental crisis, his tentacles twitching in a way that indicated deep existential turmoil. "If a theorem can be solved," he muttered, "what does that mean for the very essence of impossibility? Did we really live a lie?" He asked, "Is there really nothing that would be impossible? Are we all just terrible at math?" "Yes, probably and definitely," Zorian replied helpfully. 15 vertically, to make it look more complicated than it really is, 12 letters. The crowd grew rapidly as news of the impossible decision spread through the Institute's communication systems. Zorian saw students from various departments pressing against the doors of the hall. While some individuals were taking pictures and others were frantically taking notes, several seemed to be praying to various mathematical deities. Vtar stated that his crystal array was still emitting sparks from multiple system overloads. "That's the only explanation," he said. "People are known for their chaotic approach to solving problems," he continued. "Chaotic mathematics?" Zorian asked. "Is this what you now call basic logic?" "There's nothing basic about what you've done," retorted Brainhive 7. "You've solved a theorem that has been confusing our greatest minds," she continued. "Your greatest minds tried to juggle 17-dimensional coordinate systems by calculating the square root of negative infinity," Zorian pointed out. "I just dropped the parts that didn't make sense and focused on the ones that did," he explained. Dean Splinter's color had changed to a deeper shade of purple, which Zorian assumed indicated either that she was impressed or about to explode. "Mr. Valloris," she asked, "could you share your approach to solving problems at the Higher Mathematics Symposium next week? Would you like some coffee? The best coffee from 17 star systems, as well as a selection of delicious pastries, some with cream fillings." Zorian thought about it. "Okay, but I need a bigger napkin." 3 stellar months later, Zorian stood in front of the largest lecture hall in the Interstellar University. He looked around the audience, which included mathematics professors, theoretical physicists, and even a number deity from the transcendent realm. The hall was packed to capacity with students hanging from the rafters, and several participants were present via holographic projection from other galaxies. "Rule number 1, Zorian said, pointing to the board behind him, where he had written Human Problem Solving 101 in large, friendly letters. "If something seems impossible, you're probably over-complicating it." Professor Quillmore, who was sitting in the front row, was taking notes with the enthusiasm of a first-year student. "But how do you distinguish a real impossibility from a simple difficulty?" Zorian replied, "It's simple. Just ask yourself, am I trying to solve a problem, or am I just trying to look smart by solving a problem?" Because these are two different tasks. The audience cheered. Zorian noted that most academic problems in the entire universe have a fundamental flaw. Brilliant minds make things more complicated than necessary, often confusing complexity with sophistication. To illustrate this point, he turned to the blackboard, where he wrote down another seemingly impossible theorem: the paradox of infinite cascades of probability. Can someone tell me what makes this impossible? Valloris' hand shot up. Probabilistic computing requires simultaneous processing of an infinite number of parallel timelines, he said. Indeed, Zorian replied. And why is that a problem? Because you can't process endless data, Valloris replied. Dean Rallyweaver approached Zorian with a nervous smile. Mr. Valloris, she said, I have a question. What is your education in higher mathematics? Zorian scratched his head. Well, I took calculus in college and got a C+. What about you? I don't have a degree. I quit. In my second year of college, I helped my father at his auto repair shop. The dean's expression changed to a shade that Zorian had never seen before. It was either a deep admiration or a complete system failure. Car repair shop. Really? And it was here that I learned how to solve problems. When someone brings you a car that won't start, you don't start by rebuilding the engine. You check if there is fuel in the tank and if the battery is dead. First, you look for the obvious. And you apply the principles of car repair to advanced theoretical mathematics. The same basic approach, Zorian shrugged. Most problems are not as complicated as people imagine them to be. They're just afraid to seem stupid by offering a simple solution. As the lecture hall filled up for the afternoon, Zorian noticed that his teaching methods were spreading. Students throughout the institute began to approach problems in a more straightforward manner, what the faculty called human directness. Zorian addressed the audience, saying, Rule 2. Never be afraid to ask if the emperor is dressed. Sometimes the most intricate problems in the world are just ordinary problems with fancy names. The audience chuckled as they took notes, and several students immediately began applying the idea to their own research. Zorian looked at the sea of eager faces, people from all over the universe who had come to him to receive his wisdom. He knew that his words would stay with them for a long time, inspiring them to look at the world in a different way. I came to learn problem-solving strategies from a man who dropped out of college and made a living repairing cars. I couldn't help but be impressed by his approach. Sometimes the most obvious decision is the right one, even if it takes the rest of the world 12,000 cycles to figure it out.